there, I'm David Milne, and I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion brought to you by the Plant Symposium. It's a premier event celebrated by Landscape Ontario members and the broader horticultural community at large. Over the past decade or so, this symposium has provided a platform for industry leaders from around the globe to share their insights and innovations. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of ecological reference, a topic that is shaping the future of sustainable horticulture, and we'll talk about some other things too. In this video, we'll explore how ecological referencing influences professional practices, the origins of a passion for native plants, and the importance of the right plant, right place philosophy. We'll also discuss strategies for engaging those new to these concepts, ways to inspire enthusiasm in the field, and share some successes and valuable resources. Whether you're a seasoned professional or new to the field, you're in for what I feel is an enlightening conversation that highlights the intersection of sustainability and horticulture. So we have 4 guests with us today, and we'll introduce them all quickly. Stella Belair. Her journey into the landscape industry began in her early years, where she grew up working in her family's garden center, and that led her, on a path to study landscape architecture at Guelph. She's worked in many different sized firms. Currently, now she's teaching at Fanshawe College. This year, we're talking about environmental design and planning. Anything else you really want to let people know about yourself, Sarah?
No, I think that's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Sean James, he owns Sean James Consulting Design. He was named by Landscape Ontario as 2020 and 2021's Garden Communicator of the Year. He's been passionate about gardening for 40 years. It's been his career that entire time. He's a graduate of Niagara Park School of Horticulture. He's a master gardener. He's a writer. He's an educator. He's done a lot to help really promote the industry. I could go on, Sean, but I'm just going to try and keep it short there. Rick Gray, thank you. He's been gardening since a kid, but once he discovered native plants in 2005, he fully immersed himself into gardening with native species. He has a bachelor's degree in natural resource management, a minor in landscape ecology, and a master's degree in environmental biology. He's done a lot of teaching, volunteer work, but now he's focusing on native plants in his own property in Ridgetown, which is about half an acre. He has over 300 species of indigenous plants. That's pretty incredible. And he's recently released The Gardener's Guide to Native Plants of the Southern Great Lakes region. It is an awesome book, and I highly recommend you check it out. And finally, we have Jonas Spring. Jonas owns Ecoman Landscaping, design build firm in Toronto. He also owns the Toronto Plant Market and Native Supply Nursery in Toronto. So I'm going to start with the first question. How did your passion for native plants start? I'm going to start with you, Sarah.
Okay, well, I think for me, really, I grew up in a nursery. So my family had a family business, and I think I've been around plants my whole entire life. And it was really interesting how, when you're taking care of plants, trying to obviously make sure that they look really good so that they can be sold to clients, you're paying attention to how they're growing and how they're living. And it was really interesting to me how it was like every single day, certain plants just didn't respond really well to, let's say, the heat of the summer, or if we were in a drought in the summer, and you're always constantly having to take care of those plants. But then we also had like a native plant section in the nursery, and they were always pretty much just doing their thing. They were fine. Like, you never really had to baby them. And even as like a kid, I was kind of like, wow, that's so unique, right? That they just inherently did better. Even these are potted plants too, right? And so, that was just like a mindset that I kind of started to think about. And then I went to school, obviously. And when I really, really hit home for me is when I discovered Dr. Douglas Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home. I think it was published about 20 years ago, maybe or so. And and I watched a presentation that he gave at the Toronto Botanical Gardens, and it really provided like the scientific evidence that I needed to be able to convince, my managers and my clients, and to really kind of back up what I kind of anecdotally already was thinking about. But sometimes, it is good to have that scientific evidence. And I think that was a game-changing book for me, and it really, really kind of fueled my passion for incorporating more and more native plants as much as I could.
Awesome. That Tell Me book was a profound influence on me too. Rick, brought you to native plants?
I think for me, it was, I grew up hiking through the forest all the time and always just outdoors. And I loved what I saw. But after I retired, and well, actually before I retired even, I built a garden here and I put in wildflower seed mix in one of my gardens. And the things that were popping up were California poppy and bachelor's buttons. And I'm like, wait a minute, these aren't the things that are native for around here. So I started to explore what was native and what wasn't. And the further I went down the rabbit hole, the more addicted I became to growing natives. And when I had a friend over who saw all the pollinators on my one little patch of wild bergamot compared to her beautiful gardens that were non-native, it was just, yes, this is what I'm doing it for.
Awesome. Jonas.
I wasn't necessarily an environmentalist growing up, but I was deeply interested in the climate question in the 90s and 2000s. And I really wanted to be a part of that, and ultimately ended up in horticulture as sort of like a node where where we do have some leverage to do something, as far as like the sort of the ugly duckling of the climate question is biodiversity. So I was thinking about climate, I was thinking about the urban heat island, and I was thinking about green roofs 20 years ago. And the more I got into it, the more I was thinking about, and there was this debate about native plants in the landscape and should we be using them, shouldn't we? And I was, I grew up in the city of Toronto, and I was seeing all kinds of cosmopolitan plants that were doing very well in, the cracks and the crevices of the concrete, not necessarily native plants. But the debate was like, and then I was like, well, native to what? Like, we just have a concrete jungle that's been plopped on top of an old Carolinian forest. So I kind of didn't really understand the debate, where we don't really have an ecosystem here that resembles the historical ecosystem, because I grew up in downtown. But then I started thinking about, well, what is the reference? And then that's how I got into the whole alvars and cliffs thing, and so sort of the idea of buildings or cliffs. And so we started using those plants in my business. And then a lot of the plants that grow in cliffs and alvars, a lot of them are easy to get, but some of them are not. And so we had a real challenge with supply, and that's how I really got into it in a big way, was trying to figure out how can I use these plants at scale to do to do something big. Like if we wanted to cool the city by 1 degree, we would need, millions and millions of plants, thousands and thousands of plants per building to do that. And so that's when I started getting into native plants in a big way, was sort of realizing that it's not really a debate about whether we should be using native plants or not, but just like there isn't supply, even if we wanted to, number one. Number two, there's a whole bunch of plants that are in production or not in production that would be an incredibly useful in terms of cooling, in terms of habitat, biodiversity, pollinators. So there's all these plants that have all these functions beyond how they look that were really important to me. And so that's how I kind of got into it, was more from the climate side.
I like your comment there, Jonas, but no, it's not just about the aesthetic anymore. It's about the role that the plant plays. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind always. Sean, what brought you to
Well,
native plants?
The aesthetic's important too. I think I got to throw that out there right away. It needs to be both nowadays. My first memory was when I was 4 years old, dragging my dad out into the woods in Coldwater to help me identify a plant, Monotropa uniflora, ghost pipe. And I grew up near Crawford Lake, which of course now is famous, to speak to Jonas's point, for climate change, because that's the golden spike. They are using that as the marker for when the Anthropocene began, when we started messing with the climate really effectively. And so I would go on a regular basis there and take walks in the woods and see what was growing and living. And my property was just a 2.5 acre chunk cut out of a whole country block of conservation. So as a little kid, I had this beautiful area to roam and kind of got a leg up in the native plant world without even knowing it, because I was identifying, I like knowing things, and I was identifying everything from marsh marigold to maidenhair fern, and orchids, you name it. I just had this beautiful place to run, and fell into horticulture because a high school teacher wanted some help. And I joined the Horticultural Society, so that really broadened my horizons. I think as an industry, we need to get beyond the industry a little bit, because people like horticulturists at horticultural societies have a lot to teach us, and we think that we know more, and we don't. So I learned a lot there, and then went to the park school, and I don't know who I'd be if I didn't go there. And so I've always dealt with a high percentage of native plants in different increments over the years, climbing and climbing. And now, as so many of you know, it's de rigueur. Everybody's getting into it. We couldn't be busier because people are interested in what we have to sell. We've got butterfly gardens all through the Niagara Peninsula now, and biodiversity gardens in Oakville. The demand is really there, which sort of gives me financial permission to keep doing it. Because it doesn't matter how much you want to change the world. If you can't pay the bills, it doesn't make it so easy. But really, the public is looking for things that the industry is just starting to provide, which speaks to Jonas's point too about availability. And we're finding so many rare plants, or previously rare plants, coming on the market in saleable quantities. I can design with things like wood poppy now, Styloforum, having a pretty good shot at knowing it'll be around, and some of the sedge grasses and so on. So I think the industry's catching up to where we need it to be, and where I would like it to be, just as a plant enthusiast. And I think that we're learning, to go back to my original point, that we need to make it pretty as well, because if we want folks to buy in, and we need them to buy in to concepts like rain gardens and native plants and save the bees, save the monarchs, then we got to make it beautiful if we're going to get people to, well, frankly, pay us to do it.
Yeah. I agree 100% that there is that aesthetic quality, which is crucial to our industry, but it has to be more than just that. How would you approach the conversation about ecological referencing or leveraging native plants with people less educated on the subject? It's kind of, I think educating the general public's becoming a big issue. And how do we navigate that? I would start with Rick. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, actually, I always talk about the birds and the bees, literally. I mean, I do garden tours here regularly, and a lot of the people that come are already converts, but I get quite a few new people, and they say, well, why should I grow this? And I tell them the story. Again, like Sarah said, Doug Tallamy's book gave us that information of how many caterpillars it takes to feed a nest of chickadees. And that eyes open when you tell people that. And when they realize that the hostas in my neighbor's yard don't feed any caterpillars, but there's hundreds all through my yard all the time, then they start to think, oh, well, maybe I could grow something for a few caterpillars. I'm not going to get rid of my hostas. I warn them, though, once they start down this path, that it becomes very addictive and won't be long before those hostas are history. But yeah, it's showing them why the native plants are so important if we want to have food to eat, we need pollinators. If we don't have the right plants, we don't have the pollinators. If we want birds in the skies, all of this, we need all those native plants for them. And that's usually the tack I take.
Awesome. You know, I have to confess, I have or had a hosta addiction. At one time in my garden, I probably had 60 or more different varieties. I think I'm down to about 10 now and slowly weeding them out. Sarah, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because if you overload people with so much information, especially if this is not something that they're thinking about or dealing with on a day-to-day basis, it can be quite overwhelming. So I think you need to meet people where they're at. And I think a lot of times that just starts with having like a very, maybe open dialogue and using some active listening back at what people, well, but I love my hostas. Okay. Sure, hostas can have a place, but can you also maybe try to include, other different types of plants? But I think if you really try to avoid, jargon and really highly technical language, and try to make it a little bit more relatable to maybe your clients or to the public, I think that is important. I think it is important to not be, too hard on people who aren't doing this every single day, all day long, right? If they're just trying their best, they're trying to grow something in their yard, I think we have to be very like open about that conversation, but without, kind of, I don't know, shoving all of this information in their face. I do recognize that obviously, within the era of climate change, that it's a hugely important issue. We want to move as fast as we possibly can, but we're not going to move the pendulum so fast if we kind of take a bit of an authoritarian role with all of our clients. You got to kind of encourage them. And I think most clients, when you can explain to them in kind of like layman's terms, and just simply say, like, these hostas are not feeding anything, they're not adding to, the food web at all. But if we plant this plant, we can have nice looking foliage and also support, all of these biological systems. I think if you keep it quite simple, a lot of people really are open to that conversation. So that would be my take.
All right, thank you. Sean?
Well, I think first we need to recognize that we don't know everything. I think that the industry, the professionals, we think we're professionals. And we stop learning at some point, many of us. And I think that helps us lose touch with our clients. I think that it's beyond support of the issue. I think that those folks who are supporting it and really doing a good job of educating the public. And I think that we need to work on self-education, educating each other in the profession. I think that's going to be a big thing, and we're making great progress at tackling issues like the invasive species issue. Landscape Ontario is doing wonderful stuff on that end. There's always more to be done, and is it being done fast enough? We're doing our best, and I think we need to give ourselves a little bit of credit when it comes to that. I'm also a big fan of catching people doing something right is a good management technique. And I think we need to do that in our industry as well. Recognize the people who are doing the right stuff to support the issue. I was on a garden tour a couple of weekends ago, and several of the properties were just a sea of invasives. And the lady who was hosting the garden had a very stone face, and she would say, "Welcome to a very low maintenance garden." And she was really trying to repress her feelings on the plants that were there. And I said to her, when I look around here, my tact would be to say, well done that you're planting the Solomon seal and that you have wild geraniums here, and give people credit for what they're doing right. And that makes them be a little more open to your idea. I think between that and just general education of the public, but especially of our own inner group, I think that's the best way we can support the issues at hand.
Awesome, thank you, Sean. Jonas, your thoughts on this conversation and how do we approach it?
Yeah, I like to start off with a broad uh statement, very simplified, like one of the earlier speakers had mentioned. So for example, if they have a big tree and they are looking for something to grow underneath it or something like that, I say, well, you live in a woodland understory. And then, oh, they look at you a little different, right? Oh, I didn't think of it that way. And then you can kind of incorporate plants that like to live in a woodland understory, and it sort of bypasses a big debate. Is it native? Is it not? But really, like to start with the reference first. And I've been using that in my sales. I've been using that in my talks about trying to figure out what is the land, what are the physical dynamics that are happening in the space, whether it's a green roof or a woodland understory or a meadow or something like that. And then that's where my starting point is, so that they can kind of picture the reference first. And then when we start to talk about the plants, the the vast majority of plants we're going to recommend are going to be native, but they've already bought into the idea that the plants, I know you have a question later about it, but the plants will be suitable for the site. And that's kind of how we kind of work our way into it. And I will also just finish off by saying that a lot of the work is actually being done for us. And what I mean by that is, the city of Toronto and and nonprofits and others are really promoting this, and of course Talamy and authors like that, but they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and they're doing it uh, to our benefit. So for those of us who use these plants in the landscape, we're basically getting free marketing as it is. And that's the way I look at it. The more that the city and the nonprofits and the authors write about this stuff, the more it sort of primes the general public to accept it. And then it just makes it easier for us to do our work. So I provide resources. Like I had a client and on a ravine property who wanted all kinds of stuff that wasn't really appropriate for planting in a ravine. And I just shared the booklet with her about the stewardship booklet that the city had prepared for what to do if you have a house that backs onto a ravine. And now she comes and buys, her local Carex and all this stuff. And she just totally took that resource and went wild with it and did her own research and went down the rabbit hole. So sometimes I just, leverage the resources that are already out there that are being provided by other organizations that are kind of doing some of that heavy lifting for us.
That's a great point, Jonas, because there's a lot of great information out there already.